Hi, everybody. I'm Kay Helm, and this is the Your Voice podcast. Find your voice, tell your story, change the world. Each week, I interview someone about the way in which they live or tell their story. And this week, my guests are Rachel, Goble, and Heidi Burkey. Rachel is the CEO at The Freedom Story. Heidi is a documentary director. So I want to thank both of you for being here today.
Thanks.
In previous episodes of this podcast, we've had several shows where we've explored different aspects of nonprofit storytelling, because I really believe it's a special type of storytelling. And I want to continue with that theme. I really believe it's important. It's something we need to hear and explore on a deeper level. And the two of you are involved in a community. In fact, you started ethical storytelling. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I think so. Ethical storytelling was really born out of my 10 years of working in the NGO space and being kind of, I think, advancing from telling story in a way that maybe wasn't as dignifying as I would hope for it to be, and then learning kind of along my nonprofit journey the mistakes that I had made earlier on, and watching as other organizations were still wrestling with where I had been previously. And then when Heidi and I got connected, and Heidi's produced and directed some of our films and had a really similar heart and passion, we decided to bring kind of both angles, that NGO side and the storytelling filmmaker side, together, and said, what would happen if we started a community that was based in the belief that we as organizations can be telling these stories better. What would it look like to create a code of conduct, or at least a baseline standard of ethics around the way that nonprofits are telling story?
Heidi?
I think too, a strong vision is if you're in the entrepreneurial space, you might know about B corporations. And for me, I thought, what if we had that kind of a standard where you go to a nonprofit and you know that they're committed to a certain type of storytelling, or you're finding a filmmaker or photographer and, they have that like ethical storytelling, stamp saying that this is the type of filmmaking and storytelling that they're committed to, and just knowing from that code, basically what values they hold and the way that they're going to approach things. And we just kind of wanted to make it a collaborative effort, because it's not just the two of us who are having this conversation. It's multiple conversations over the years in different countries with different people, that we thought, why don't we just create the gathering place where all of this knowledge and expertise can be placed. And for us, it just became creating a website where we serve as the gatherers of people and information, and just put it out as resources through webinars, through online documents, and through podcasts, which explore some of the personal side of what it means to tell stories ethically.
And that's a great resource. And I absolutely agree. A lot of us, we get into the nonprofit world and we encounter the people with these really amazing and compelling stories, and we want to help. And we, a lot of times though, our reaction is, oh, this is such a great story. And we don't think about how we tell it. Mm-hmm. And so it has this unintended effect.
Yes.
What was the thing that started you on this project?
Heidi, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think for myself, I worked in a nonprofit creating films, and then kind of extended out to working for other nonprofits, establishing their stories. And I found myself, the way that I was drawn to telling stories had a lot of assumptions and beliefs written into them without the intention of that, and often kind of utilize the extremities of our stories to evoke emotion. And what I found was that these films that I was creating, the emotion was not long-standing when, especially in areas if we're talking about people's individual trauma and them overcoming horrific situations and, arriving at a new place and stronger and better because of this nonprofit's involvement. I found that the connection with audiences was always momentary with those things, because it created an otherness by seeing it's almost the viewer and the
person's story being told became more of an us-them, because we were separating them and almost making them on a pedestal of look what they've overcome. And there wasn't actual connection between humans. And so for me, there was a moment in my own career where I said that I needed to change the way I approach storytelling, because it wasn't sustainable. The way that I was telling stories wasn't sustainable, both for fundraising, for connectivity with nonprofits. And so I took a step back and I said, what is the point of storytelling? And I think that's where I looked at story and said, what's the universal gettable? What is the human experience in this person's story that someone on the other side of the world could understand? And it was more simplifying it. If it was an orphan in Nigeria who never knew his father, that was it. For me, the universal gettable in that story was no longer, oh, this is an orphan and then he found a home. It was this desire for belonging, for a place where someone knows you and that you can identify yourself with, which we all understand that feeling and emotion. Yes. We've all had that at some point in our lives. So that became the focus of my storytelling, is what are the common human connections that I can make in the stories. And through that, it was an arrival of ethical storytelling, realizing that it was not for a particular end goal other than connection, and trusting that human connection is the strongest bond that we can help guide and create. But it doesn't look often the way that nonprofit storytelling has looked in the past. And it's, not always done in the same way that we've done in the past. So it's been a challenge to incorporate. But when I find organizations like the Freedom Story who are willing to approach things differently and kind of let go of control of an outcome, we've been able to discover really beautiful things in the process.
I think you're absolutely right that a lot of times the way we tell the stories does create that disconnect and the us and them. Mm-hmm. I know in my own experience, that's been one of my frustrations, and continues to be one of the things is how do you balance things that, if you just stay on the surface, especially where, you're in very different situations, but people are the same all over the world. And those basic needs that you're talking about, especially belonging, are so huge. And if we can find ways to connect. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Heidi, as a filmmaker, there's a lot of equipment involved in that. How does that equipment, having a camera, microphones, lights, how does that affect the story?
Equipment can be a barrier between connection. And so for myself, one thing I started to do when I was even building out budgets, when I am looking at working with a nonprofit, is I always build in 1 or 2 days on the front end of arriving at a location where I simply just spend time with the people that we're going to film. And without my filmmaker hat on, with just as Heidi, and just connecting with them without looking at them through a lens or any certain type of intention. And for me, it's crucial, because then the filming days, which are often very few, became more intentional, and I was able to read their body language better, because I had been very aware of it from the beginning, knowing when they're comfortable and not comfortable, and knowing when to move one direction or another, and it became vital to make that connection before cameras ever came out. And it's something I do not only in my nonprofit work, but in my documentary work as well. And so, yeah, the tools then also explaining to people how things work, because you show up sometimes in international locations and people have never seen the equipment that you have and they don't know what it is. So a lot of it is explaining and communicating and allowing them to know what these tools mean. And one thing that Rachel is really good at, and that we've integrated into our values at Ethical Storytelling, is that explaining and making sure the person understands where their film will be going and that they have consent for it to be used in that way. Mm-hmm. And if it's going to be put online, explaining what online means and the breadth of where that might be able to go and the people that might be able to see it, and ensuring that we have consent for that beforehand. So that there's a lot of that I put into practice to ensure that our storytelling, people feel safe and comfortable and very aware of where their story is going and how it's being told, and that they have a voice in that process.
And Rachel, when you talk about having a voice in the process, what does that mean with the organization that you lead?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll share a story with you that was one of the more influential stories for me in kind of shaping what ethical storytelling means and how we incorporate those values into our organization, which I think it's also important to say early on that we're still learning. Mm-hmm. I think that there's no organization that's perfect at this. And I'm sure that a decade from now, we're going to be looking back on the mistakes that we're making now. And that shouldn't hinder us from still trying to really get at the root of what is that human story and what is that connection point. And I do think that storytelling piece for a nonprofit is absolutely critical and essential to what we do. And so in terms of, so let me share a story. There was a young woman named Kat, and she's actually going to be releasing her interview on our podcast in a couple weeks. And we started our documentary process with telling her story. And then the organization, The Freedom Story, grew out of that documentary. And we started her filming process in 2007. The film was completed in 2008. And that was when the nonprofit was started. And Kat is, at the time was 11 years old, and her mom had a really difficult past. And we interviewed Kat and asked for a lot of really personal details about her life. We interviewed her mom and asked for a lot of really personal details about her life. We brought in other interviewers to kind of supplement the story, and all of the documentary was pointed towards, hey, look, Kat is at risk of being trafficked, and here's what as an organization we can do to protect children like her. And it was an absolutely beautiful film. The big mistake that we made during that time, and I think this is the lesson that we've carried forward, is two different things. One is that Kat didn't fully understand where and how that film was going to be used. It was never really explained to her. And secondly is that we didn't really think about what it would mean for Kat when she became 18, 19, 20 and entered the job field, to have a documentary like that out in the world that was highlighting who she was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so she puts it really eloquently when she says that she just doesn't want to be remembered in that way. And that's why she asked for us to not put the film online. To her, that story is still precious and sacred and carries a part of her history that she loves. And yet she still wants to be seen for who she is today. And so the ways I think that we incorporate ethical storytelling, or at least the values of it, into our work really tie into what does the person want to see? What will make them proud of who they are? What will shine a mirror in front of them that says, and this is kind of something that I think Heidi has taught us, that story should make them see how strong they are. And that story should show them the resilience and the courage and whatever that character attribute is, that as an organization you're applauding, you're cheering on in them every day, that story hopefully will be a mirror to that for them in times where life might feel overwhelming. And I think that as an organization, that's the goal. The goal is not to create pity stories that involve donors, but the goal is to create stories that show our youth or our constituents how strong they are.
And this is for either of you or both, what do you hope to see change in the way that nonprofits share stories?
I think for me, that would summarize into something really simple, and it would be constituent first and donor second. And what I mean by that is that the majority of nonprofits, ourselves included, tell story to generate donations, to show transparency to the work. And that's not bad. But in that, we've lost the reality that these stories are now being put online, that our youth are seeing them. All of our kids at the Freedom Story have Facebook, and so they see what we post on Facebook. They like it. They get excited when a picture of them is posted. And so you have to, as an organization, be highly aware of the fact that the World Wide Web exists and that the majority of people in the world have access to it. And so I think that those constituent first, donor second stories will change the way in which not only donors start to move away, hopefully, from what might be donor fatigue, because I think that the more sensational stories we continue to tell, the more donors are becoming fatigued. Donors want to see those stories of hope and of courage. And I think once you start focusing on that constituent first story, that's what emerges from that.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and I would add to that in the fact I'd love to see so many nonprofits harness the values of ethical storytelling to the point that their donors or people viewing their work also change their expectations of what to expect from a nonprofit, the type of storytelling, that it becomes almost a leader in creativity and human connection, and not one that we think, okay, this film is going to have this crying baby with snot running down its nose, and that's going to motivate me to give. I want the expectation of motivation to ultimately shift among those that are receiving, and to see older, really well-established nonprofits feel free to let go of what they feel dependent on in terms of the type of storytelling that has been ingrained in their culture for so many years, and allow themselves to move beyond it and take the risks necessary to have more value placed on those constituents.
Let me ask you specifically now about the framework that you're creating there and the standards. So you have, at the Ethical Storytelling website, you have an actual set of standards and a pledge. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things on there?
Yeah, so the pledge is right now kind of the framework in which we're asking people to consider operating from. And what's beautiful about the pledge is that it had a lot of different voices and people and perspectives that touched it in its creation process. And so if you read through it, you'll see that there's some guidance, but there's also some points that are a little bit more reflective. And that was done intentionally so that the goal being every organization is different. If you're working in human trafficking, if you're working in HIV/AIDS, if you're working in education, if you're working in Oakland, if you're working in Bangkok, every organization is different and will have different needs or different questions to ask themselves in that story creation process. And so the goal with the ethical storytelling pledge and any guidelines or conversations we have in that space is not to create a set of black and white rules, because that would be really unhelpful, but rather to provoke question and reflection and to say, okay, what's kind of the golden standard that we're moving towards? And it really is that tell others stories as you would want your own to be told. And I think that out of that has come a set of best practices or standards and reflections that we hope that people will consider.
I think we're very particular on there as well about our language, talking about evolving and learning from one another and knowing that we have not arrived. We're continually arriving, and that everyone's voice is a contribution to that. And so we're really committed to a diversity of voices, of experiences, and always having that posture of learning and the ability to self-reflect and even see in our greatest efforts where we're still maybe lacking what we need to truly value and tell stories well.
I want to go back to what you just mentioned there, the diversity of voices. Tell me a little more about what you mean there.
Well, part of that is simply integrating constituent voices in this process as well, so that it's not just storytellers or practitioners. We also have those who have been on the other side and can share what their experiences are like in sharing their story. Part of it is also very international. If you see our webinars or our podcast interviews, they are coming from all corners of the world, and also all different types of realms of practice that people work in. And so with even storytellers, it's a part of finding people who are doing things differently and unique, not just the photographer, the filmmaker, finding the writer, finding someone who maybe is a poet, or, different angles and approaches, so that we're constantly showing a diverse possibility of where this idea of ethical storytelling can touch.
Yeah, good. Rachel, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I think Heidi summarized it really well. I agree.
Great. What I want to do is just mention a few words, and I'd like you to tell me briefly what each of these words means to you in the context of storytelling, and especially with vulnerable populations. You up for that?
Sure.
Okay. Let's start with dignity.
For me, dignity, it almost is revealed after a film is complete, where someone feels seen and valued for all parts of who they are.
I think dignity for me, when I think of that word and use that word in this context, goes back to two things. One is someone being honored and respected. And two, does that person feel a sense of pride and self-respect about their story and about themselves?
Okay. Relationship.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think cat is a mental image that comes into my mind when I think of that, because we've known each other now for about 12 years, and she's lived with me here in the States doing some English programs, and has become, she says mom. She says I'm like her mom, and I always correct her and say I'm more like your sister. I'm not old enough to be your mom. But I think that the relationship word in this context is, have you seen each other's weakness and mutual, not just has the organization seen your weakness, and has the organization, seen your vulnerabilities, and has the organization seen your joys, but it needs to go both ways. It's equal vulnerability, it's equal trust, it's equal safety, it's equal respect, so that you really know one another, and especially on the constituent side, that they feel comfortable saying no, because I think in organizations will give so much to individuals that there can be a sense of indebtedness there, and relationship has the ability to move past that.
This one is unique for me because as a storyteller, I'm moving around to multiple organizations and situations, so I don't often have the ability to have repeated experiences with people. So for me, relationship in this context is being willing to give whatever I am asking the person to give me, and sharing of myself with them just as much as I'm asking them to share with me.
Yeah, and that can be really powerful. Rachel, you mentioned indebtedness to the organization, and my next word was power.
I think when I hear that word, I know you're asking, I forget are you asking us to share what we think about? Because I think when I hear that word power, I hear a goal, I think, or like a perspective change. And so a good friend, I'm going to quote somebody else here because I can't even claim to be this brilliant, but a good friend of mine named Sophie Otiende, she's an amazing survivor activist in Kenya, and she's just so powerful. And she explains ethical storytelling so brilliantly when she says that ethical storytelling is when the most vulnerable person in the room has the power. And so that's what comes to mind for me when you say that word.
Yeah, that's good. She has a lot of really good things to say. I listened to one of your earlier webinars just recently, and she's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Goodness, I don't know how to follow that because that is my favorite quote from her. There's no words need to be added to that.
Yeah, she's said it all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something I think we need to hang on our walls and carry with us in our hearts everywhere we go when we're collecting stories. And here's a word that gets used a lot, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. Victim.
Yeah, for myself, that when I hear victim, I think more mentality than actuality. And it's a mentality I struggle with personally in my own life, not to view myself as such. And so
if anyone is introduced to me in that way, my first response to that is to discover the reality in that person, those strengths, even beyond survivor. What are the tools that have risen to the surface in this person's life due to the circumstances that they have endured, and finding ways to call that out in them. A lot in my storytelling process, I make mental notes of what I see in the person's character. And then I always make sure when cameras are off, and sometimes it happens when they're on, to let that person know what I see in them.
Oh, that's beautiful. What would your advice be if I'm going into a country and I'm going to be there for maybe a week, and I may never come back, and I go back and I want to tell my friends, maybe my church, maybe an organization, but oftentimes we're telling friends and a closer circle. Of course, there is social media too, but what's your advice for folks maybe going on a short-term trip with how they tell those stories that they encounter?
Yeah, I think if assuming in this context that short-term trip is going to have involvement with an organization that maybe they're connected to, or their church is connected to, or something like that, my encouragement is always for people on those short of trips to not ask to be involved with the constituents that the organization serves, but instead to connect with the leadership and to ask the leadership of that organization, what are the challenges you're facing? Where can we be supporting you? What are your needs? And that if you're going to ask those questions, to actually follow up with them, and don't just ask them because you're trying to fill time, or it's kind of what is like the standardized questions that you ask when you visit an organization, but truly follow up, because that's where the relationship should and will start, is with the leaders of that organization. And then if you continue to build a relationship with those organizational leaders over time, you'll learn more about the nuances of the work, the nuances of the constituents that they serve, and the realities of their needs, and then have a deeper understanding of how you as an individual can continue to support them, either stateside or wherever you may live, or as you continue to go back year after year. It will give you more education so that your support is truly making a difference, and you're not just having kind of a one touch point and then jetting out.
I think I have two thoughts in this realm. And one is, before a trip, I think if you are going alongside an organization, is to ask them for their code of conduct in communication and in connecting with people that they work with, and asking for that up front. And if they don't have it, asking for them to put something together so that you know the expectations on the ground. And also, the thing that comes to mind is the only stories we own are our own. And even interacting with someone and then coming back and communicating something that they told you to friends is not actually a story that we own unless we've asked permission. And I think even simply, sometimes when we travel, there's experiences that are shared with us that can be really deep. And we want to share that with others so they get an understanding of the reality to the places we've been. But the truth is, unless we've looked that person in the face and said, I'm moved or I'm touched by this aspect of your story, would you give me permission to share this with my community at home? Unless we've gotten that verbal permission from someone, I really think those aren't ours to go and share, because it does put a perspective, or it might limit a person's understanding of that individual or the location that we've traveled to that one story, which is never a whole picture. And so I think that is, asking permission is something that we need to be doing, even just in our conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What is next for ethical storytelling, the community?
We've been talking a lot about how to start engaging donors in a thoughtful way. And I think that we've geared most of our content towards nonprofit practitioners and storytellers. And the more that I'm having these conversations, the more I'm seeing a desire from donors and foundations to really understand how they too can participate in supporting organizations to these higher ethical standards of storytelling through the questions that they ask or how they consume the media that might be given to them. And so we're starting to develop a webinar and podcast series and some training material for donors, which I'm really excited about. And it'll be kind of a new realm for us to enter into.
Yeah, we do have an upcoming webinar that will be in early September, which is going to be a how-to for storytellers. And we started our series of webinars with just Ethical Storytelling 101. And then we did a how-to for practitioners. And now we'll do a how-to for storytellers, where I will have guests, a writer, a photographer, and a filmmaker to give practical tools of how they integrate ethical storytelling into their work. And that will be followed by a podcast series of interviewing different storytellers in the field. And we have other webinars that we have planned out, one on social media. We've talked about future webinars about storytelling in conflict zones. So now that we're kind of setting the foundation after this final how-to, we're really going to start making things a little bit more focused in terms of our training and really get into some of the nitty-gritty. So we're also always looking for people who have expertise in an area or have a topic that is relevant to it to be part in sharing that, because we interview a lot of people in our webinars. Rachel and I just serve as moderators. We're not the experts in everything, so we're always looking for people who are willing to teach and share in the community.
Those are great resources. And we'll, as always, we'll have the links to your website and to any of the resources that you've mentioned here. All those links will be available in the show notes at yourvoicepodcast.com.
Wonderful.
I want to thank the both of you for being on the show today. It's really, again, this is a topic that's really dear to my heart, and always working in our organization to improve on how we handle people's stories and how we honor people in that way. So I really appreciate that and everything that you're doing.
Thanks, Kay. We appreciate you making space for these conversations to happen too.
Thank you, Kay.
And thank you for listening. Make sure you check the show notes at yourvoicepodcast.com. All the links we talked about are there. Please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. That will help other people find the show. I'm Kay Helm. Until next week, this is the Your Voice Podcast. Find your voice, tell your story, change the world.